CIH TLV guidebook. I'm using the 2016 version. The gentleman that gave us the guidance is using the 2012 version for the spring 2014 exam. So first of all, it's a private, not-for-profit, non-governmental corporation. It's a scientific organization. It's not a standards setting body. The TLVs and BEIs are not consensus standards, but represent scientific opinion. Levels of exposure that a typical worker can be exposed to without adverse health effects. These are not lines between what is safe and dangerous exposures, and no consideration is given to either the economy, the economic, or technical feasibility of those standards. So that's kind of some things to remember. Next is the notice of intended cycle. Written authorization for use and citing and releasing the information has to be done for each of the things that are cited for data. There's a 4-month period beginning February 1st through May 31st. After that date, they're included in the next year's publication. There's a 10-page limit on that, not including the citable material. There's an executive summary, list of recommendations, actions, rationale, and last, the cited material. Again, after May 31st, submissions go to the next year's review. Let's go ahead and go into the introduction, which is on pages 3 to 9 of the TLV book.
Okay, tonight I'm going to read through toxicology and just hit kind of the high points. First of all, we're going to talk about proliferative, and non-proliferative. So the proliferal types, first of all, proliferative means progressive and complicated. And I'm going to basically just say what the type of, what the disease is and then what the aerosol type is. So the disease for proliferative, silicosis is the disease, and that's the aerosol type is silica, comes from quartz, tripoli, chert, flint, granite, and sand. The disease asbestosis comes from silicates, comes from chrysotile, it comes from amosite, crocidolite, and anthophyllite. Co-workers, pneumoconiosis, also known as black lung, and anthracosis. That comes from anthracite coal, hard coal, and it's mainly in the eastern coal. Shaver's disease, progressive with high silica content. It comes from bauxite, which is an aluminum ore. So those are the proliferative. Now we're going to go into the non-proliferative, which is talcosis, which comes from talc silicate. There's co-workers simple pneumoconiosis, which again is bituminous black lung disease, and that comes from bituminous coal, and it's soft coal. Stenosis, which comes from tin, iron ore, also known as cassiterite. Then there's siderosis, which comes from iron oxide. There's some minor pneumoconiosis, comes from carbonates, and minor pneumoconiosis come from non-crystalline silica. Then we're going to go into biological. Of the biological, bisonosis is also known as brown lung. Also known as brown lung, comes from cotton dust. Bagasosis comes from moldy sugarcane. Woodworker's asthma comes from wood dust. Chronic bronchitis comes from grain dust. Suberosis comes from moldy corks. Farmer's lung disease, also known as mycotic infection, comes from moldy hay. Mushroom worker's disease comes from mushroom spores and compost. And printer's asthma comes from gum of acacia or Arabic. Next, we're going to talk about toxicology one-liners. This is on page 47. Mercury is mad as a hatter. Selenium is garlic breath. Vanadium is green and black tongue. Aluminum bauxite is shaver's disease. Iron oxide is siderosis. Iti disease from environmental poison cadmium in the rice fields in Japan. DBCP reduces sperm count and can cause sterility. Carbon tetrachloride causes oliguria. Best guess of an LD50 in a man given an LD50 of an animal is based on the surface ratio of 1 to 9. Tritium is urine assay. Antimony poisoning is similar to arsenic poisoning. B-naphthylamine can cause bladder tumors. Caisson's disease, nitrogen bubbles in the blood, i.e. the bends. Lead was associated with the fall of Rome, use of lead pots. Yellow phosphorus causes bone necrosis. Dyspnea causes difficulty breathing. NO2 irritates the lower respiratory tract. Solvents affect the central nervous system on a chronic basis. Particles less than 5 microns in size reach the alveoli. Febrile illness is caused by zinc oxide. Febrile, F-E-B-R-I-L-E. Organic mercury is excreted in the feces. Inorganic, elemental mercury is excreted in the urine. The BEI for styrene is mandelic acid. Monday morning angina caused by nitroglycerin. Xenobiotic crosses the placenta by diffusion. The beryllium TLV was established in a cab in 1938, according to Harriet Hardy in a reference to the lead standard. Diethylamine smells like fish. Uranium damages the kidneys. Idiosyncratic reactions. Patients with an atypical reaction to a chemical. Aneuploidization, to lose a chromosome. Benzidine can cause urinary bladder cancer. Palmism is caused by tetraethyl lead. Alkyl mercury is most hazardous when ingested. Organic lead can cause muscle pain. Cyclohexane has no systematic effects when absorbed through the skin. Schwann cells, peripheral nervous system damage. Elemental mercury is not absorbed or toxic when ingested. Didn't know that. Arsine exposures affect the red blood cells. Copper is stored in the liver and bones. Moving on to page 47. Manganese can cause metal fume fever and Parkinson's disease. Nickel itch, eczema. Western red cedar wood can cause occupational asthma and is a sensitizer. Hapten reacts with proteins. Ethylene glycol is a reproductive hazard. Lead affects the hematopoietic system by heme synthesis, decreases red blood cell life, and stimulates the erythropoietic system. Procarcinogen is a substance that is metabolized to a direct-acting carcinogen. Carcinogens are electrophilic. Mercury is nephrotoxic. Silver is tightly held by the body. Solhydryl groups. Arsine causes hemolysis of red blood cells. Polar compounds are easily excreted. Lead. ZPP is a measure of blood exposure. Blood lead is a measure of body burden. White phosphorus causes phossy jaw. oat cell carcinoma of the lung, oat cell carcinoma of the lung caused by bis chloromethyl ether. Anesthetic gases can cause miscarriages. First member rule, benzene. Rabies, go with bats. Newcastle disease is caused by birds and chickens. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, caused by ticks. Anthrax, associated with exposure to wool. Coccidioidomycosis, San Juan Valley fever from spores. Histoplasmosis, from exposure to spores in a bird excrement. Afebrile, without fever, from NO2 exposure. Last of these is called the BEI trivia one-liners. Benzene is phenol in urine. Cadmium is cadmium in urine. Carbon disulfide is 2-thiothiazolidine, 4-carbolic acid. Chromium 5, you want to look at total chromium in urine. CO, you want to look at COHB, carboxyhemoglobin in blood. Ethylbenzene, you want to look at mandelic acid in urine. Fluorides, you're looking at fluorides in urine. And hexane, you're looking at 2,5-hexanedione, 2,5-hexanedione in urine. Lead, looking at blood lead and ZPP in blood. MEK, you're looking at methyl ethyl ketone in urine. Phenol, total phenol in urine. Styrene, mandelic acid in urine. Toluene, hippuric acid in urine. Trichloroethylene, trichloracetic acid in urine. And last, xylene, which is methyl hippuric acid in urine. Industrial hygiene history. Key people relevant to industrial hygiene include Hippocrates in 400 BC, father of modern medicine, wrote about lead, colic, and the toxicity of metals. Pliny the Elder, 23 to 79 AD, Roman scholar, described respirators made from animal bladders used in mines. Galen, 130 to 200 AD, Greek physician, wrote on acid mists and copper miners. Ulrich Ellenbog, 1473, produced pamphlet describing effects of industrial lead and mercury poisoning and suggested preventive measures. Philippus Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541, Swiss alchemist and physician, wrote on hazards of mining. It is the dose alone that makes the poison. Georgius Agricola, 1494 to 1555, German physician who wrote several mining diseases. Carpathian Mountains, women married several times because of the spouse's death from consumption, also known as tuberculosis, published in his book De Re Metallica. Bernardo Ramazzini, 1633 to 1714, Italian physician who wrote what is considered the first complete treatise on occupational diseases in 1700. Known as the father of occupational medicine, his famous quote is, "When a doctor visits a working-class home, he should be content to sit on a three-legged stool. If there isn't a gilded chair, and he should take the time for examinations, and to the questions recommended by Hippocrates, he should add one more. What is your occupation?" Percival Pott, in the 1960s, researched and published on the role of soot in causing scrotal cancer in chimney sweeps. Alice Hamilton was a first woman professor at Harvard University. When I talked to my medical friends about the strange science on this subject, industrial medicine, I gained the impression that here was a subject tainted with socialism or with feminine sentimentality for the poor. The American Medical Association had never had a meeting devoted to this subject except for a few surgeons attached to large companies. There were no medical men in Illinois who specialized in the field of industrial medicine. John Bloomfield, modern-day father of industrial hygiene. Marcus Key is the first director of NIOSH. George Gunther is the first Secretary of Labor of OSHA. Key events and relationship to industrial hygiene history. Injured employees had to sue unless employers volunteered to pay. Few employers volunteered because they could hardly lose in courts. Judicial precedents limited the employer's liability. There were three things: the fellow servant doctrine. Employer was not responsible if an employee's injury resulted from the negligence of a coworker. Assumption of risk concept. Injured employee presumably knew the risk of the job before he agreed to work. And the last one, contributory negligence argument. Employees shared responsibility for an accident. The last section is on health and safety timeline. So there's the Mine Act of 1842, which limited hours of working children to fewer than 12 hours per day. In 1902, the U.S. Public Health Service was established. 1905, Massachusetts State Board of Health employs first workplace inspections. 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire results in the first worker compensation laws. In 1912, the United States Public Health Service expanded as an occupational health division. 1913, the National Council for Industrial Safety, the National Safety Council, was organized. In 1913, New York State Department of Labor is the first to form an industrial hygiene division. 1917, Supreme Court affirmed employers' responsibility for employees' safety and health regardless of who's at fault. Under workers' compensation, a worker forfeits chance to sue for higher damages, including pain and suffering, in return for a fixed schedule of payments, usually a percentage of weekly income. 1922, the impinger and standardized dust measuring methods were developed. 1930, the Gauley Bridge disaster, West Virginia. That's where that hydroelectric tunnel was being built and people died of silicosis. 1930, hat-making industry, mercury poisoning of fur cutters, also known as Mad Hatter disease. 1935, Social Security Act, provided funds for public health programs in IH. Public Health Service opens a division of industrial hygiene. 1936, the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act established rules which federal contracts of $10,000 or more would be granted and retained. Key provision is no part of such contract will be performed in any plants, factories, buildings, or surroundings or under working conditions which are hazardous, unsanitary, and dangerous to the health and safety of employees engaged in the performance of said contract. 1938, ACGIH was formed, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. 1939, American Industrial Hygiene Association, AIHA, was formed. And in 1960, the American Board of Industrial Hygienists originates in Pennsylvania. 1970, the OSHA Act, William Steiger Bill, received union support from Ralph Nader. 1972, the Noise Control Act on community noise was established. 1976 was TSCA, Toxic Substance Control Act. 1976, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. 1977, Clean Water Act. 1977, Federal Mine Safety and Health Act, or MSHA. 1980, Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, also known as CERCLA. And in 86, the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act is known as SARA.
Introduction to the biological exposure indices. The BEIs are guidance values for assessing biological monitoring results. Biological monitoring is desirable because of the potential for significant absorption via an additional route of entry, which is usually the skin. Relationship of BEIs to TLVs. BEI determinants are an index of an individual's uptake of chemicals. Inconsistencies may be observed between information obtained from air monitoring and biological monitoring for a variety of reasons, which include physiological makeup and health status of the worker, occupational exposure factors, non-occupational exposure factors, methodological factors, location of the air monitoring device, particular particle size, distribution, and bioavailability, and variable effectiveness of the personal protective devices. Specimen collection. So we've got two different columns. We've got sampling time, and then on the second column we've got recommended collection. So prior to the shift should be 16 hours after exposure ceases. During the shift, anytime after 2 hours of exposure. End of shift, as soon as possible after exposure ceases. End of work week, after 4 or 5 consecutive working days with exposure. And discretionary is at any time. BEIs apply to an 8-hour exposures, 5 days per week. They should be used as listed regardless of the work schedule, so you shouldn't try to adjust them. They're not recommended to be adjusted or used by correction factors on the BEIs. All right, that's it for BEIs. Let's move on to the next one. The next thing we're going to talk about is noise, which is on page 131. Noise is sound pressure levels and durations of exposure that represent conditions where nearly all workers may be repeatedly exposed without adverse effect. The measuring device should be set to an A-weighted network with slow meter response. Values apply to a total duration of exposure per working day, regardless of whether this is one continuous exposure or a number of short-term exposures. All on-the-job noise exposures of 80 decibels or greater should be used in the above calculations. C1, concentration C1 over T1 plus C2 over T2. Doses more than 100%, the TLV is exceeded when the dose is more than 100%, as indicated on a dosimeter set with a 3 decibel exchange rate and an 8-hour criteria level of 85 decibels. The TLV is exceeded on an integrated sound meter when the average sound exceeds the values in Table 1. And Table 1 has a number of values. The most common one is 8-hour day for ACGIH is 8 hours is 85. For OSHA it's 90. No exposures of an unprotected ear in excesses of a C-weighted peak sound pressure of 140 decibels should be permitted. Exposure to certain chemicals may also result in hearing loss. These include carbon monoxide, lead, manganese, styrene, toluene, xylene. Ototoxic effects also include arsenic, carbon disulfide, mercury, and trichloroethylene. The background level of the spaces used for relaxation and sleep should be 70 decibels or below. Let's go ahead and look at electromagnetic fields on page 137. Whole body is 2 Tesla. Whole body of 8 Tesla is requires special worker training and control workplace environment. When you get into the 20 Tesla, then your limbs are going to be affected, and medical device wearers are typically in the 0.5 millitesla. All right, let's move on. We're looking at microwaves. Radio frequency, radiation in the frequency range of 30 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz. Go ahead and move on to ergo, which is on page 180, 181. Discomfort that persists from day to day or interferes with activities of work or daily living should not be considered an acceptable outcome of work. Due to a complex nature of the disorders, there is no one-size-fits-all. Many of the non-occupational factors include rheumatoid arthritis, endocrinological disorders, acute trauma, obesity, pregnancy, age, gender, level of physical condition, previous injuries, diabetes, and then recreation, leisure activities. We're going to go on now to cold, which is on page 205. So you got cold stress. During exposure to cold, the maximum severe shivering develops when the body temperatures have fallen to 35 degrees C or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Progressive clinical presentations of hypothermia, in brackets, between 29 and 32 degrees Celsius. Consciousness clouded, blood pressure becomes difficult to obtain, pupils dilated but reaction to light, shivering ceases. Progressive loss of consciousness at 30 degrees C, muscular rigidity increases, pulse and blood pressure difficult to obtain, respiratory rate decreases. So those are all between 29 and 32 degrees Celsius. Between 21 and 22 degrees Celsius, maximum risk of ventricular fibrillation. Let's move on. Work warming regimen. Workers should be under constant protective observation. Let's go ahead and move on. We're going to go on to, from cold, we're going to go into heat stress. So we're going to get into heat stress. The goal of this TLV is to maintain body core temperatures within plus 1 degree of normal, 37 degrees C. Heat stress is the net load to which a worker may be exposed from the combined combinations of metabolic heat, environmental factors, and clothing requirements. Heat strain is the overall physiological response resulting from heat stress. You're ultimately trying to keep from getting into heat stroke. Table 1 is clothing adjustment factors for some clothing. So between cloth and work clothes, long sleeve shirt and pants, which are 0, addition to the wet bulb temperature, all the way up to limited use vapor barrier coveralls, which add 11 degrees Celsius to the table. With direct exposure to sunlight, that's outside work, and then without exposure to sun is anything inside or at night. Some important factors for metabolic rate. So light, the rate is 180 watts. That's some sitting, manual hands, some standing with light work. Moderate is sustained moderate hand and arm work, moderate leg and arm work, moderate arm and trunk work, or light pushing and pulling. Normal walking, that's 300 watts. Heavy, which is 415 watts, includes intense arm and trunk work, carrying, shoveling, manually sawing, pushing and pulling heavy loads, and walking at a fast pace. And then the last one is the very heavy, which is 520 watts, very intense activity at fast to maximum pace. Guidelines for limiting heat strain include you want to sustain heart rates. If this happens, one of the following measures may mark excessive heat strain. Sustained heart rate is in excess of 180 beats per minute minus their age. Their body core temperature is greater than 38.5 degrees Celsius or greater than 38 C in unselected, unacclimated workers. So the first one is 38.5 in acclimated personnel, and the 38 is in unacclimated personnel. Recovery heart rate at 1 minute after peak work effort is greater than 120 beats per minute, where there are symptoms of sudden and severe fatigue, nausea, dizziness, or lightheadedness. They're definitely at greater risk if there's profuse sweating, if you have a weight loss of over greater than 1.5% of the body weight, or 24-hour urinary sodium excretion is less than 50 millimoles. So really important stuff there. Never ignore anyone's signs or symptoms of heat-related disorders. Again, the prime objective of heat stress management is the prevention of heat stroke, which is life-threatening and the most serious of the heat-related disorders. Definitions and notations. Minimal oxygen content is when you have an oxygen-deficient atmosphere. It's a pressure of oxygen less than 132 torr. The minimum of 19.5% oxygen at sea level is 148 torr. Atmospheres deficient in oxygen do not provide adequate warning, and most simple asphyxiants are odorless. Particular at elevations greater than 5,000 feet, where that particular ambient pressure of oxygen is less than 120 torr. Values appearing in parentheses in the adopted TLVs section are to be used during the period in which the proposed change for that value or notation appears in the NIC. Particulate matter, particulate size. For solid and liquid particulate matter, TLVs are expressed in terms of total particulate matter, except for the terms inhalable, thoracic, or respirable particulate mass are used. Nanomaterials are those that are 100 nanometers or smaller in one or more dimension. Particles insoluble or poorly soluble, not otherwise specified, PNOS. Concentration should be kept below 3 milligrams per meter cubed for respirable and 10 milligrams per meter cubed for inhalable particles. Biological exposure indices, BEIs. BEI-A stands for acetylcholinesterase inhibiting pesticide. BEI-M stands for methemoglobin inducers. And BEI-P stands for PAHs. Carcinogenicity, an agent capable of inducing benign or malignant neoplasms. We're going to go over the specific notations later, but A1 through A5. Inhalable fraction and vapor. Sensitization, dermal and/or respirable sensitization, RSEN and DSEN. These TLVs are not intended to protect those workers who have already become sensitized. Skin comes through the cutaneous route, through the skin. It also includes mucous membranes in the eyes. ACGIH recommends a number of adopted BEIs that provide an additional tool when assessing the total worker exposure to selected materials. The use of a skin notation is intended to alert the reader that air sampling alone is insufficient to quantify exposure accurately, and that measures to prevent significant cutaneous absorption may be required. We're going to look specifically at Appendix A. Again, there's 5 different levels of carcinogenicity. A1 is a confirmed human carcinogen. A2 is a suspected human carcinogen. A3 is a confirmed animal carcinogen with unknown relevance to humans. A4 is not classifiable as a human carcinogen, and A5 is not suspected as a human carcinogen. Particles not otherwise specified do not have a TLV, are insoluble or poorly soluble in water, and last have a very low toxicity. So they've got to meet all 3 of those. Particle size, selective sampling criteria for airborne particulate matter. There's 3 different types of sizes. There's inhalable particle matter for those materials that are hazardous when deposited anywhere in the respiratory tract. There's thoracic particulate matter TLVs, which are for those materials that are hazardous when deposited anywhere in the lung airways and the gas exchange. That's TPM-TLV. And there's respirable particulate matter TLVs, which is RPM-TLVs for those materials which are hazardous when deposited in the gas exchange region. Next page, let's go ahead and look at the inhalable fraction and the thoracic fraction. And then also the respirable fraction. When you have two or more hazardous substances with similar toxicological effect on the same target or organ system, their combined effect, rather than that of either individually, should be given primary consideration. It's the sum of concentration 1 over T1 plus concentration 2 over T2, etc. Possible combinations of threshold limits when applying an additive formula. There's a number of those, and we're not going to go into detail. Appendix F, minimal oxygen content. Adequate oxygen delivery to the tissues is necessary for sustaining life and depends on the level of oxygen in the air, the presence or absence of lung disease, the level of hemoglobin in the blood, the kinetics of oxygen binding to the hemoglobin, the cardiac output, and the local tissue blood flow. The brain and myocardium are the most sensitive tissues to oxygen deficiency. There's a table, F1, and it's on page 87 of the ACGIH booklet. It's a plot of oxygen partial pressure with increased altitude, showing the recommended oxygen partial pressure of 132 torr.
Ergonomics, Chapter 18, page 187. Ergos means work, nomos means law. The laws of work are the study of work. Ergonomics looks at how work affects people, physiological response to stress, reduce fatigue by designing tasks within people's capacity. Human factors looks at worker-machine interface or worker-machine engineering, people's behavior as they interact with equipment, workplaces, and their environment, people's size and strength capabilities, relative to operations and equipment. Primary goal is to improve worker performance and well-being through the application of principles that affect the interaction of humans and their working environments. Let's go ahead and look at the different types of things that can happen. There are three different types of consideration when looking at anthropometry deals with human dimensions. So how high would you recommend a doorway be to accommodate 95% of the population? That's one example. Biomechanics looks at factors influencing human movement. Moment is a quantity necessary to cause or resist motion, so force times the distance. Compressive force is force pushing two structures together. So one of the things you have to really be aware of is you have to be aware of different types of musculoskeletal trauma. So you got tendonitis, which is inflammation of the tendon. Often results when the muscle tendon is repeatedly tense with little or no rest time between repetitions. Tenosynovitis, inflammation of the tendon and or sheath around the tendon. Ganglionic cysts, tendon sheath swells with synovial fluid. Epicondylitis, inflammation of the tendinous attachments at the elbow. Nerve trauma is the second one that can happen. And carpal tunnel syndrome is an example of that, compression of the median nerve inside the wrist. The last ones are all neurovascular disorders, like the thoracic outlet syndrome. That's the compression of the nerves and blood vessels between the neck and shoulder. Vibration-related disorders, mechanical stresses resulting in the constriction of blood vessels. We're on page 195, chapter 19, medical considerations. The objectives of medical surveillance are to prevent primary and secondary prevention and match worker capacity to job demands through both physical strength and cardiopulmonary fitness. And then identify high-risk, hypersusceptible populations. TLVs protect nearly all workers, but not all. It's a challenge to identify the less resistant. Hypersusceptible workers tend to be at greater risk to workplace hazards due to inborn or acquired factors. Habits also are a factor. Smoking and increased risk from exposure to asbestos. Alcohol consumption and interactions with organic solvents, including carbon tetrachloride. Alpha-1 antitrypsin test, when positive, is an indicator of potential chronic obstructing lung disease in individuals exposed to respiratory irritants. Hemoglobin S test, used to test for sickle cell anemia. G6PD test, used to test for hemolytic anemia. An abuse test, it's a screening test for carbon disulfide susceptibility. Skin and pulmonary tract are typically the most affected organs in hypersensitive workers. Types of medical surveillance, there's pre-placement exams that includes medical history, physical exam, pre-existing and present conditions, chest x-ray, drug and alcohol screen, audiometric exams. And then the second one is periodic pre-assignment exams, asbestos, benzene, butadiene, DOT, hazmat, lead, coke oven emissions, cotton dust, 1,2 DC, DB, CP. Medical surveillance tests, most of the exams are screening procedures. For those substances with low potential for serious health effects, workers should be screened with questionnaires. For more toxic and hazardous substances, a pre-placement medical exam should take place. And then lastly, for substances not known to cause effects, no medical surveillance is generally necessary. Biological monitoring, primary advantage is a better estimate of risk, but it has some disadvantages. Those include lack of adequate toxicological information on many chemicals. There are many false negatives, lack of technology, lack of the ability to differentiate non-work related exposure. Other considerations include biological half-life, specimen integrity after collection. There's a number of occupational lung carcinogens. These include asbestos, which comes from mining, milling, insulation work, and removal. There's arsenic, which comes from, again, mining, metal refining, and agricultural chemicals, pesticides and herbicides. There's chloromethyl ethers, which are used in ion exchange resins and also used in the textile industry. Chromates, coal tar distillates, which include coke ovens, tar, and asphalt. Radiation, which includes uranium mining, fluorspar, and hematite mining. And lastly, nickel. Occupational skin disease is the most commonly reported occupational illness. Occupational skin cancers include actinic keratosis, arsenical keratosis, basal cell epitheliomosis, and squamous cell carcinoma. Occupational infections and biological hazards. Anthrax is a spore-forming bacterium, Bacillus anthracis, from warm-blooded animals, either sheep or cattle, that are transmissible to humans from handling usually wool sorter's disease. Brucellosis is a bacteria transmitted to humans when handling infected meats. Undulate fever, Malta fever, and Bang's disease are examples. Leptospirosis is penetration of the skin from an infected animals and or their urine. Examples include Weil's disease, Swinehurst disease, Canicola fever. Tetanus, which is penetration of the skin that causes toxins to be produced in the body by the Clostridium tetani, Clostridium tetani. Plague, infected fleas on sheep, rodents, and other wild animals that bite humans. Black Death or bubonic plague are examples. Tuberculosis, which is health workers are exposed to individuals with TB through inhalation of infected droplets. Erysipeloid, infections to butchers who handle fish and poultry. It's spelled Erysipeloid. Erysipeloid. Tularemia, a disease of rodents resembling the plague that is transmitted by bites from fleas, flies, ticks, and lice. Examples include flea fever, rabbit fever. Rabies, bites or scratches from infected animals. Farmers, trappers, veterinarians are susceptible. Cat scratch disease is a viral infection of the chlamydia type from cats and dogs. Milker's nodules, animal pox virus from milking infected cows. Hepatitis is health workers who become exposed to infected bodily fluids. Rickettsial and chlamydial diseases, formerly classified as virus but now known to be small, true bacteria that multiply in anthrods and are transmitted to humans. Examples include Rocky Mountain spotted fever from ticks and Q fever from ticks and other wild animals. Ornithosis, a chlamydia infection from nasal, feces, tissue, and feath droppings of infected birds. Example includes parrot fever. So those were all the biological hazards. Fungal diseases, Candida albicans are ubiquitous in nature and are considered part of the normal human flora, but can cause infection in the skin and mucous membranes, commonly in dishwashers, bartenders, cooks, and bakers. Aspergillosis, inhalation of a fungi of low pathogenicity from plant and animal matter that affects asthmatics. Coccidioidomycosis, endemic in the semi-arid southwest, caused by the inhalations of spores of Coccidioides immitis that cause a respiratory infection. Fungus. Histoplasmosis, a pulmonary infection from fungus growing on soils enriched by bat, chicken, or other birds' excrements. Sporotrichose, a fungus on plants that penetrate the skin to cause hard, red, nodular lesions that spread their way up to the extremities.
Okay, we're going to go Introduction to the Chemical Substances on page 3 of the CIH booklet. General information. Their guidelines or recommendations to assist in the evaluation and control of potential workplace hazards and for no other use. So they're not for evaluating or controlling community air pollution, nor are they for estimating toxic potential of continuous uninterrupted exposures or other extended work periods, nor for proving or disproving an existing disease or physical condition in an individual. They should not be used by anyone who's not trained in the discipline of industrial hygiene. They are definitely not regulatory consensus standards. Definition of TLVs, which are the threshold limit values. They're airborne concentrations of chemical substances and represents conditions under which it is believed that nearly all workers may be repeatedly exposed day after day over a working lifetime without adverse health effects. Chemical substances with equivalent TLVs, i.e. the same numerical values, cannot be assumed to have similar toxicological effects or similar biological potency. Skin is an important, although the TLVs refer to airborne concentrations, dermal exposures may possibly occur in the workplace, so skin is a key there. Threshold limit values, time-weighted average, TWA, is based on a conventional 8-hour workday, 40-hour work week that may be repeatedly exposed day after working a lifetime without adverse effect. Although calculating the average concentration for a work week rather than a workday may be appropriate in some instances, a CGIH does not offer guidance regarding such exposures. The threshold limit value, short-term exposure limit, TLV-STEL, is a 15-minute time-weighted average that should not be exceeded at any time during a workday, even if the 8-hour time-weighted average is within this time-weighted average threshold. They can be exposed continuously without suffering from irritation, chronic or irreversible tissue damage, dose rate-dependent toxic effects, or narcosis of sufficient degree to increase the likelihood of accidental injury, impaired self-rescue, or materially reduced work efficiency. This should occur no more than 4 times a day, and there should be at least 60 minutes between successive exposures in this range. An average period other than 15 minutes may be appropriate. The threshold limit value ceiling is a concentration that should not be exceeded during any part of the working exposures. TLVs based on physical irritation should be considered no less binding than those based on physical impairment. Peak exposures. Peak exposures are for those that don't have short-term or ceiling values. So peak exposures are considered to be similar to the TLV short-term exposure limit, and they are as such. Increases in worker exposure levels may exceed 3 times the value of the TLV TWA level for no more than 15 minutes at a time, and no more than 4 occasions spaced 1 hour apart during the workday, and under no circumstances should they exceed 5 times the TLV time-weighted average. In addition, the 8-hour time-weighted average is not to be exceeded for an 8-hour work period. That's considered the 3-5 rule. When a TLV STEL or TLV ceiling is available, this takes precedence over the peak exposure values we just discussed. Whereas the TLV ceiling places a definite boundary that exposure concentration should not be permitted to exceed, the TLV time-weighted average requires an explicit limit to the excursions which are acceptable above the recommended TLV time-weighted averages. Standard temperatures and pressures are 25 degrees Celsius and 760 torr, and a molar volume of 24.4 liters per mole. Unusual work schedules. Short work weeks can allow workers to have more than one job. That's a concern that you have to be aware of. One model is the Brief-Scalio model, 1986. Which should not be used to justify very high exposures as allowable where the exposure periods are short. So when you go from like an 8-hour day to a 10-hour to a 12-hour day, 10-hour day is 0.7 times the time-weighted average, whereas or the PEL, whereas 12-hour days is 0.5 times the time-weighted average or the PEL. TLV units. A gas is a chemical substance where the molecules are moving freely. Gases assume no shape or volume. A vapor is a gaseous phase of a substance that exists as a liquid or a solid at standard temperature and pressure. The amount of vapor given off by a chemical substance is expressed as a vapor pressure and is a function of temperature and pressure. The last substance type is an aerosol, and that's a suspension of solid particles or liquid droplets in a gaseous medium. Other terms used to describe aerosol include dust, mist, fog, fume, fiber, smoke, and smog. TLVs for aerosols are in mass of the chemical substance in air by volume. which is milligrams per meter cubed for aerosols. Right, that's it for that one. Let's see if I can get back.